The rain had only just stopped, leaving the diner windows streaked with silver when the wheelchair rolled through the front door, and the conversations that had filled the room moments earlier dissolved into the uncomfortable silence that only strangers can create. Mud clung to the heavy tires, a faded navy jacket rested across broad shoulders that still carried the unmistakable posture of discipline, and beside the chair walked a black German shepherd wearing a worn service harness whose amber eyes swept every corner with practiced precision. The smell of fresh coffee, grilled onions, and warm bread drifted through the air, but no one seemed interested in food anymore. They were watching the man instead. Some glanced at the prosthetic leg extending beneath the blanket over his lap. Others stared at the long scar that disappeared beneath his collar. A few simply looked away, uncomfortable with reminders that courage sometimes arrived carrying visible pain. Ethan Mercer noticed every glance without reacting to any of them. Years earlier, he had learned that silence often revealed more about people than their words ever could. His left hand rested lightly against the shepherd's neck, and the dog leaned closer for the briefest moment before returning to his calm, alert posture. His name was Ranger, a retired military working dog who had served beside Ethan in places neither of them would ever speak about. Together they had survived explosions, ambushes, endless nights of uncertainty, and the quiet loneliness that followed when the uniform came off and ordinary life expected extraordinary memories to disappear. Today Ethan wanted nothing more complicated than breakfast and a cup of coffee before continuing the long drive to another veterans' rehabilitation appointment 2 states away. The diner, tucked beside an aging highway, looked ordinary enough to offer exactly that. Every booth was occupied. Every stool along the counter held someone halfway through a meal. The only empty chair remained at a small table near the window where a young woman sat alone reading a paperback while absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. She looked no older than 30, dressed simply in a blue sweater with loose strands of brown hair falling across her face each time she lowered her eyes to the page. Unlike everyone else, she hadn't spent the last minute staring at Ethan. She had looked up once, offered the smallest polite smile, and returned to her book. Ethan wheeled closer, careful not to interrupt her. His voice carried the calm steadiness of someone accustomed to asking for little. "Can I sit here?" She looked up immediately, closing the book without hesitation. "Of course. Please do." She reached for the extra chair, moving it aside so the wheelchair could fit comfortably beside the table. It was such an ordinary gesture that it should have gone unnoticed, yet somehow it drew more attention than if she had stood and applauded. 2 men at the counter exchanged disapproving looks. A woman whispered something to her husband while pretending not to stare. Near the cash register, the assistant manager frowned before walking quickly toward the table with forced professionalism stretched over obvious irritation. "I'm sorry, sir," he said with a tight smile that never reached his eyes. "Service animals are welcome, but some guests have complained. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable outside on the patio." Ethan looked toward the rain-soaked patio where empty metal tables glistened beneath puddles of cold water. There wasn't a roof over half the seating area. Ranger remained perfectly still beside him, ignoring the conversation entirely. Ethan spoke quietly. "It's still raining. The patio isn't covered." The manager shrugged almost imperceptibly. "I understand, but we're trying to keep everyone comfortable." Before Ethan could answer, the young woman closed her book completely and met the manager's eyes. "He's disturbing no one?" he asked politely. "I invited him to sit here." The manager forced another smile, though this one looked thinner than the first. "Some customers feel nervous around large dogs. Ranger has more self-control than most people in this room," Ethan replied without anger. A few diners laughed awkwardly. Others looked embarrassed. The manager's expression hardened. "Rules are rules." Ethan nodded slowly. "Fine. We'll leave." His hand reached for the wheel, but before he could move, Ranger did something he had never done in public. The shepherd planted all 4 paws firmly against the floor and refused to take a single step. Ethan stopped. "Ranger. Heel." The dog didn't move. His ears lifted sharply toward the rear hallway leading to the kitchen and storage rooms. Every muscle beneath his black coat became rigid. Ethan's heartbeat changed instantly. During their years together, Ranger had ignored gunfire, explosions, helicopters, and screaming crowds without hesitation. Disobedience simply wasn't part of who he was. Ethan gave the command again, softer this time. Ranger. Heel. Nothing. The dog's breathing slowed instead of quickened. His eyes never left the hallway. Ethan followed the stare. There was nothing obvious. Waitresses carried plates through swinging kitchen doors. A cook laughed loudly somewhere beyond the walls. Silverware clinked against ceramic plate. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Yet Ranger remained frozen. The young woman noticed the change before anyone else. "Is something wrong?" she asked quietly. Ethan didn't answer immediately. His military instincts, dulled by retirement but never erased, awakened with uncomfortable familiarity. He had seen Ranger react this way only a handful of times, each before danger revealed itself. Not fear. Detection. Recognition. Certainty. Across the room, the manager sighed dramatically. "Sir, if your dog won't cooperate, I'm going to have to ask you to remove him." Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on Ranger. "He's cooperating. That's what worries me." Several customers exchanged confused glances. One teenage waiter stopped carrying drinks halfway across the room. Even the clatter from the kitchen seemed strangely distant now. Ranger's nose lifted slightly into the air. His breathing became deeper. Then he released one low, controlled growl so quiet it almost disappeared beneath the hum of the refrigerator compressors. Ethan had never heard that sound inside a civilian building. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't fear. It was warning. He slowly released the wheel of his chair and rested both hands on Ranger's shoulders, feeling the steady tension beneath the thick fur. His own pulse accelerated despite years of training that taught him never to panic. The young woman noticed his face lose its remaining color. Whatever she saw there erased every doubt from her expression. Ethan whispered almost to himself, "Not here, please, not here." Ranger's gaze remained locked on the hallway. Then, without barking or lunging, the shepherd took one deliberate step forward and stopped again. At that exact moment, a faint metallic sound echoed from somewhere behind the kitchen wall, so soft that almost no one else noticed it. Ethan did. Ranger certainly had. The former SEAL closed his eyes for the briefest second, and when he opened them again, he was no longer the quiet, disabled veteran looking for breakfast. The calm in his face had transformed into the unmistakable focus of a man who had survived impossible situations before. He looked directly at the young woman beside him and spoke with absolute certainty. "Whatever happens next, stay behind me." Then Ranger let out a single sharp bark that silenced the entire diner. Everybody stays calm. No one touches a light switch. No one uses a lighter. No one plugs in or unplugs anything. Move slowly toward the front door. His command carried quiet authority, and without realizing why, people obeyed. The same customers who had judged him moments earlier now followed his directions without question. The assistant manager still hesitated. "You're not in charge here," Ethan answered without raising his voice. "No. But if there's a gas leak, arguing wastes oxygen and time. Choose." The manager's confidence finally cracked. He nodded and began guiding customers toward the exit. Chairs scraped softly across the floor as families gathered, children and elderly diners helped one another stand. Nobody ran. Ethan made sure of that. Panic caused mistakes. Calm saved lives. The young woman remained beside him. "Shouldn't we leave too?" He looked toward the hallway. "There's still someone inside." She saw something in his eyes that words couldn't explain. It wasn't recklessness. It was responsibility. The kind that refused to count safety complete while someone else remained in danger. "I'll help," she whispered. Ethan shook his head gently. "You already have. You treated me like a human being before anyone else did." Now help them get outside. She wanted to argue, but Ranger turned briefly toward her and gave the slightest nudge with his nose, almost as though agreeing with Ethan. Tears formed in her eyes. She nodded and hurried toward a frightened elderly couple struggling to walk. Ethan wheeled toward the kitchen. Ranger stayed close, moving with deliberate caution. The hallway smelled faintly of grease and detergent at first. Then came the unmistakable odor. Gas. Stronger now. Strong enough that Ethan's expression hardened. The storage room door hung half open. Inside, metal shelving had collapsed across the floor. Canned goods, broken boxes, and cleaning supplies lay scattered everywhere. Beneath the twisted steel framework, one of the cooks struggled to breathe. His leg was pinned beneath the heavy shelf. A cracked gas pipe hissed steadily from the wall behind him. Ethan surveyed everything in seconds. Ranger remained near the doorway, watching every movement. The cook looked up with frightened eyes. "Please, don't leave me. I can't feel my leg." Ethan rolled as close as possible before locking his wheelchair. "I won't leave. But you have to stay calm." The man nodded weakly. Ethan examined the collapsed shelves. Too heavy to lift alone. His wheelchair limited his leverage. He searched the room. A steel pry bar leaned against the far wall beside a toolbox. Too far to reach. Ranger noticed it first. Ethan pointed. "Bring it." The shepherd moved instantly, gripping the bar carefully in his mouth before laying it across Ethan's lap. "Good boy." Ethan positioned the bar beneath the shelving and pushed with every ounce of strength remaining in his arms and shoulders. The steel groaned but barely moved. Sweat rolled down his forehead. Years ago his legs would have finished the job effortlessly. Now only stubborn determination remained. The cook cried out in pain. Ethan adjusted the angle and tried again. This time Ranger surprised him. Without command, the dog braced his powerful body against the shelving and pushed with controlled force. The combined effort shifted the twisted metal just enough. The trapped man pulled his injured leg free with a scream. "Go," Ethan ordered. "Crawl." The cook dragged himself toward the doorway where Ranger immediately stepped aside to clear the path. Ethan reached for his wheelchair wheels. Then he heard another sound. Not from the gas pipe. A faint electronic beep coming from deeper inside the storage room. His eyes narrowed. The rhythm was deliberate, mechanical, familiar. Everything inside him went cold. Ranger heard it too. The dog froze once again, staring past the broken shelves into the darkness beyond. Ethan's face lost every trace of relief. The gas leak had never been the thing Ranger was trying to warn him about. It had only been the first danger. Somewhere beyond the collapsed storage racks, hidden in the shadows where no one had looked, something else was counting down. The bark did not echo like an angry outburst. It cut through the diner with the precision of an alarm that had waited until the final possible second. Every fork stopped halfway to every mouth. Every conversation vanished. Even the old ceiling fan seemed suddenly louder as it pushed warm air across the room. Ethan's breathing slowed instead of quickened. Years of combat had taught him that panic stole time, and time was the one thing people never realized they were losing. Ranger stood as motionless as carved stone, his ears fixed toward the kitchen hallway, his body angled slightly in front of Ethan's wheelchair as though creating a living shield. The assistant manager forced an uneasy laugh. "He's upsetting everyone. Control your dog or I'm calling the police." Ethan didn't even look at him. His eyes remained on the hallway. "Has anyone been back there in the last 2 minutes?" The manager frowned. "Of course. The cooks." "Why?" Ethan listened instead of speaking. There it was again. A metallic click. Then silence. Not the ordinary silence of people working. A different kind. The silence that followed interruption. The young woman beside him noticed it too. The laughter from the kitchen had disappeared. The sizzling grill still hissed, but no voices answered one another anymore. Ethan leaned closer to Ranger. "What is it, partner?" The shepherd inhaled deeply, then looked back at Ethan for only a heartbeat before returning his attention to the hallway. It was enough. Ranger wasn't confused. He was confirming. Ethan had trusted that look through deserts, mountain villages, and bombed city street. He would trust it here. He turned toward the nearest waitress. "Ma'am, how many employees are in the kitchen right now?" She blinked nervously. "4, maybe 5. Why?" Ethan's voice remained calm. "When was the last time you heard one of them speak?" She opened her mouth to answer but hesitated. She couldn't remember. Around the diner, uncertainty spread faster than fear. Customers began glancing toward the swinging kitchen doors. Someone stood. Another reached for a phone. The assistant manager folded his arms, trying to reclaim authority. "This is getting ridiculous. You're frightening my customers." Ethan finally met his eyes. "No. I'm trying to keep them alive." The words landed with unsettling weight. Before anyone could respond, a teenage busboy burst through the kitchen doors. His face had turned ghostly white. He stumbled into the dining room before collapsing against a table. He tried to speak, but only broken breaths escaped. Finally he forced out 2 words. "He's trapped." Ethan rolled forward immediately. "Where?" "Gas room, behind storage, shelves fell. I couldn't lift them." Then the boy looked over his shoulder with growing panic. "I smelled gas." Every instinct inside Ethan sharpened. Propane. Natural gas. He had smelled both enough times to recognize the danger they carried. Ranger's growl deepened, not louder but more urgent. Ethan looked around the room. Ethan did not move. The faint electronic pulse reached him again, steady enough to erase every hopeful explanation his mind tried to invent. Ranger stood perfectly still beside the overturned shelves, every muscle locked in disciplined restraint. Outside, through the narrow kitchen window, he could see customers gathering beyond the parking lot, confused and frightened but alive. The young woman who had offered him a seat was helping an elderly couple across the wet pavement while keeping one anxious eye fixed on the diner door. She had no idea that the danger everyone believed they had escaped was still inside the building. Ethan inhaled slowly, letting years of training quiet every unnecessary thought. Fear had never saved anyone. Clarity had. He followed the sound with his eyes until they settled on a small insulated delivery backpack wedged behind a fallen storage cabinet. It looked ordinary enough to be ignored by anyone rushing through the room, yet nothing about Ranger's behavior had ever been ordinary. Ethan reached carefully toward the bag without touching it. The zipper had been pulled halfway open. Inside, beneath disposable food containers, wires disappeared into a compact electronic device whose tiny display continued its relentless countdown. It was not a military explosive. It was crude, improvised, assembled by someone who knew just enough to make it deadly. The leaking gas surrounding it transformed the entire building into a trap waiting for the smallest spark. Ethan immediately withdrew his hand. Years earlier he had learned the most dangerous mistake was believing confidence was the same thing as competence. He was not an explosives technician. He was a man who understood risk well enough to respect it. He reached into his jacket, removed his phone, and dialed emergency services with remarkable calm. His words were short, precise, impossible to misunderstand. Gas leak. Possible explosive device. Highway 8 diner. Full evacuation. Bomb squad immediately. The dispatcher began asking questions, but Ethan had already given the information that mattered most. Ranger never looked away from the backpack. The shepherd's breathing remained slow, almost peaceful, as though he understood that panic would only cloud Ethan's judgment. Outside, distant sirens had not yet appeared, but Ethan knew they were coming. The problem was time. The digital display continued to fall. He wheeled backward toward the kitchen entrance where the injured cook had collapsed beside 2 terrified employees. None of them noticed the expression on Ethan's face. They saw only a disabled veteran who somehow remained impossibly composed. "You need to leave now," Ethan said. The cook shook his head. "What about you?" Ethan offered the faintest smile. "I've spent my whole life making sure other people got home. Today isn't different." Before anyone could protest, Ranger stepped between Ethan and the employees, gently guiding them toward the exit with quiet determination. Even frightened strangers seemed instinctively willing to follow him. Within seconds the kitchen emptied. Ethan and Ranger were alone. The building had become strangely beautiful in its silence. Coffee still dripped into glass pot. Pancakes browned slowly on forgotten grills. A radio somewhere behind the counter continued playing an old country song to an audience that had vanished. Ordinary life had paused, suspended between catastrophe and hope. Ethan looked at Ranger. "We've had worse mornings, haven't we, partner?" The shepherd's ears twitched. His tail gave one slow wag. It was the same silent answer he had given before countless missions. Together. Always together. Ethan knew the bomb squad might arrive in time. He also knew they might not. He examined the room one final time. The damaged gas line hissed steadily against the wall. The backpack rested only a few feet away. Then he noticed something almost hidden beneath the fallen shelving. The main emergency gas shut-off valve. Twisted metal blocked most of it, leaving only a narrow opening. From where he sat, he could not reach it. His wheelchair simply could not angle close enough. Years ago he would have crossed that distance in 2 strides. Now it might as well have been across a river. He stared at the valve for several long seconds before looking down at Ranger. No command came immediately. The dog waited. Ethan rested a hand on his companion's head. His voice softened until it was almost a whisper. "Remember the warehouse exercise in Virginia?" Ranger tilted his head slightly. Ethan pointed toward the red valve. "Turn it." Ranger looked from Ethan to the valve. During their years of service, he had learned hundreds of complex commands, many never spoken outside classified training ground. Ethan gave one quiet word. "Close." Ranger moved instantly. Slipping between broken shelving and scattered debris with astonishing precision, he reached the valve, gripped the metal handle with his teeth, adjusted his footing, and pulled with the full strength of his neck and shoulders. At first nothing happened. Ethan felt his heartbeat slow even further. Then the old valve groaned. Rust cracked. The handle turned another inch. Ranger repositioned himself and pulled again. Suddenly the loud hiss filling the room faded, weakened, and finally stopped altogether. Silence settled over the storage room. Complete silence. Ethan closed his eyes for one grateful moment. The greatest danger had disappeared. The device still threatened the building, but without the spreading gas, its power would be dramatically reduced. Less than a minute later the first police officers burst through the diner doors, followed by firefighters and bomb technicians already sprinting toward the kitchen. They found Ethan waiting calmly beside Ranger, pointing toward the backpack instead of speaking about himself. The specialists quickly secured the area and removed the device. One technician later admitted that had the gas continued flowing for only another minute, the resulting explosion would likely have destroyed the entire diner and claimed dozens of lives. News crews arrived before sunset. Witnesses eagerly described the disabled veteran who had taken control when everyone else froze. Reporters searched for dramatic interviews, but Ethan quietly declined every camera placed before him. He insisted that the firefighters, police officers, paramedics, and bomb technicians deserved the attention because they had completed the work he had only begun. The assistant manager approached him long after the flashing lights had disappeared. His confidence had been replaced by visible shame. "I judged you before I knew anything about you," he admitted, struggling to meet Ethan's eyes. "I saw the wheelchair before I saw the man." Ethan looked toward the diner where employees were already cleaning shattered dishes from the floor. Then he looked back at the manager with surprising gentleness. "We all see with our eyes first. The important part is whether our hearts catch up afterward." The man nodded silently, tears gathering despite every effort to hide them. The young woman found Ethan beside his truck a little later, Ranger resting peacefully at his feet. She handed him the paperback she had been reading inside the diner. A small note rested between its pages. "Thank you for reminding me that courage usually arrives quietly." Ethan smiled as he tucked the note inside his jacket. No medals had been mentioned. No rank. No heroic speeches. Just a simple sentence written by someone who had chosen kindness before knowing his story. Somehow that meant more than any decoration hanging in a museum. As the sun settled beyond the highway, Ethan opened the truck door and waited while Ranger climbed inside with the slow confidence of an old soldier who had fulfilled one more duty. The engine started. The road stretched endlessly ahead. There would be more strangers, more ordinary mornings, and perhaps more moments when people would judge before they understood. Ethan no longer feared that. Scars could hide strength. Silence could carry wisdom. And sometimes the safest person in the room was the one everyone had underestimated. Because the world is rarely changed by the loudest voice in the crowd. It is changed by the quiet soul who chooses to stand firm when everyone else steps back. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who still believes that kindness and courage can appear in the most unexpected places, and let its quiet reminder travel a little farther than the road Ethan and Ranger disappeared down that evening.